that you're in a classroom that requires you to have a post-it note of this size. But unfortunately, all you have is a post-it note of this size. What do? In this video, we're going to look more in depth about how working memory impacts classroom activities and how really your students or your child's post-it note size makes a whole world of difference when it comes to classroom activities. Now you remember in the last video we talked about how an average 10-year-old has 4 apples. Unfortunately, some 10-year-olds have a very small post-it note. Their working memory looks like an average 2-year-old. They can only remember 2 pieces of information. If you imagine a 5-year-old in a class of 10-year-olds, the teacher is talking too fast, there's so much information that they have to receive, they can't keep up, they can't spell all the words, they don't know what some of the words mean. It's very overwhelming for a 10-year-old with poor working memory in the classroom. Now on the top end, we have some 10-year-olds who look like an average teenager. So back to our apples, they look like they have 6 apples. They can remember 6 pieces of information. Again here, if you imagine a teenager in a class of 10-year-olds, they're raising their hand before the teacher has even finished asking the question. They finish their activities very quickly. Maybe they're a little bored because they've done their work so fast. That's what it's like for a 10-year-old with very good or very high working memory. What kind of demands do classroom activities put in a student's working memory? I'm going to talk about 3 working memory demands in the classroom. The first is space. If a student has a small post-it note, they simply can't remember enough information, as we saw with the apples and the average 10-year-old compared to a 10-year-old who looks like an average 5-year-old. Now, this might mean that when a teacher gives too many instructions that exceed their limit, they simply can't keep it all in mind, like the kindergarten teacher from Seattle that we talked about in the last video. It could also mean if the teacher gives a long sentence, they simply can't keep those instructions in mind. Let me give you an example from a classroom that I was working with. The teacher told her students, put your papers in the green packet, put your arrow cards away, get your coloring books and come and sit on the carpet. This was a set of instructions given to a group of 6-year-olds. Now you can imagine those with poor working memory simply couldn't do all those instructions. They put their papers away and they were the first ones on the carpet because they hadn't done any of the other instructions in the middle. They couldn't keep it all on their small post-it note. The second limit to working memory is time. When a teacher gives instructions too quickly, they can't keep up. They can't process the information fast enough, and as a result, they simply can't complete the activity. When we talk about dyslexia and working memory, we'll look a bit more closely about how time and processing impacts working memory. The third limit to working memory is keeping track. This is when a student has to juggle multiple things to perform an activity. Let me give you an example from a classroom that I was working with. Here's what the teacher wrote on the board. Monday, the day of the week. And then the title of the activity, mark it, just below that. But the student with poor working memory simply couldn't keep track of her place. The whole aspect of looking up at the board and looking back down at her paper when she was writing meant that this is what she wrote. M-O-N for Monday and K-E-T for the market. She just confused all that information and put them all in a single line. This is a very common error in the classroom in students with poor working memory. You see this in a lot of written activities because it's so much information that they have to keep in mind as well as process or work with that information, and so they end up making errors. Let me tell you why I became fascinated about working memory. It was about 10 years ago and I was part of a government-funded project. Part of this project meant that we looked at hundreds of 6-year-olds across the country. We tested them on their IQ scores, we tested them on their working memory scores, And one of the things I did was just sit in the classroom and observe them. What do they look like? What kinds of behaviors were they exhibiting? And one little boy really stood out. He was a real joy. His name was Andrew. He loved being at school. He was one of these kids that just relished being there, and he would just run up to the playground and made new friends very quickly. He loved participating in group discussions in the class. But halfway through the school year, I began to notice a change in Andrew. He began to make errors in spelling his name, for example. He would spell his name with 2 A's, or perhaps leave out the W at the end. He began to get very frustrated that he wasn't able to complete his activities. Sometimes he would raise his hand, and when the teacher called on him, he would shrug his shoulders and get frustrated and say, "Oh, please don't ask me, teacher, I've forgotten again." 2 years later, again part of the same government-funded project, I followed Andrew. I watched him in the classroom. I was surprised to see that he was a completely different student. He was in the lowest ability group in his language, as well as his math. He was really struggling with learning. He had almost disengaged from education altogether because he was so frustrated. At first I thought maybe Andrew had a learning disability. Maybe he had low IQ. But in fact, I found that none of those were the right answer. And in the next video, we're going to look a bit more at how to support a student like Andrew.